Hello and welcome to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Bertie Harrison-Bruninsky, and today I'm talking to Professor Gökçe Günel from Rice University about her new book titled Floating Power: Energy, Infrastructure, and South-South Relations. The book documents the development of Ghana's energy mix, with particular focus on the emergence of floating power plants, built out of old dry carrier ships by Turkish conglomerate Karadeniz Holding, and transported to Ghana in the 2010s as a stopgap measure to fix a years-long power crisis. Gökçe conducted field research over years in Ghana and Turkey, observing key parts of the process from shipbuilding to negotiating contracts, recording frank interviews with insiders, and even travelling with President Erdogan. Beyond this history, though, the book is a study of the concept of energy transition, the geopolitics and strategies of international deal-making within the energy sector, and the adaptability and persistence of fossil fuel infrastructure.
I don't know if you can use something like this as a predictive tool to understand what's going to happen at the end of the Iran war. But there are broad lessons that are available in this story, I think, for us to think about. And these broad questions about the way in which wars reshuffle geopolitical relationships, enabling certain kinds of openings for certain actors and closing opportunities or making opportunities unavailable to others. So that kind of mixing up the political scene is what we're seeing now.
I began by asking Professor Günel what drew her to the idea of floating power plants, and to explain some of the history behind powerships and Karadeniz Holding.
I became interested in the floating power plants because I started seeing how they were producing electricity for the Lebanese grid in the 2010s, and there were two ships there which were often featured in the media. And I was able to arrange a meeting with representatives of the company in 2016. By 2016, they were both wrapping up some projects and starting some new ones. And they were very excited to talk primarily about a project that started in December 2015, which was their project in Ghana. The ship that I discuss in the book was at the time their largest ship and their first ship producing electricity for the African market. And the company representatives believed that they had more opportunities in African countries, especially the African countries that had coastal access, could be good clients for them. And they were right in that prediction because the ships spread across the continent soon after that conversation and now operate in many countries. And during this period, I was also seeing how so many Turkish business people were in awe of the project and were admiring it and were thinking, this was such a risky venture and it was such a quirky thing. And how did they actually put ships and engines together in this way to produce electricity, etc. And as people watched the development of this project in awe, I became curious about how it had initially started. And there was a lot of media coverage of the early days of the project, even though it wasn't necessarily perhaps as under the spotlight as it was in the 2010s. As I read more, I realized that the project was in fact a product of the destruction of the Iraqi electricity grid. So Iraq had a really robust electricity grid. It has been able to invest its oil revenues into infrastructural development in the 70s and 80s. And by the time the Gulf War started in 1990, 1991, they had about a 9,000 megawatt electricity production capacity. But the U.S. aerial bombings on the grid were so devastating for Iraq that by the end of the war, the grid had been decimated, and so had other parts of the electricity generation infrastructure. And at the end of the war, they had about 300 megawatt electricity production capacity left. After the Gulf War, there was an embargo on Iraq, and there were many reasons why that grid could not be developed. And it became a huge health crisis for the Iraqi people as well, because obviously if you don't have electricity, you don't have water purification. There's so many secondary effects to not having a well-functioning electricity grid. So when the U.S. invasion began in 2003, there had already been a setup for bringing in external electricity producers into the market, because there was a clear need for that. And for the U.S. occupation itself to extend itself, electricity was necessary. So at the time, you should also think about what was happening in Turkey across the border from Iraq. The Turkish parliament had voted against having US troops deployed in Turkey, but that doesn't mean that Turkish corporations weren't necessarily part of the war effort in indirect ways. So, for instance, when the Turkish electricity market started unbundling and Turkish electricity producers now gained the ability to export electricity across the border, Karadeniz, so the floating power plant company, became the first company to sell electricity across the border to northern Iraq. This project was a very small amount of electricity that was being exported, but quite significant, and especially in the Turkish public's eye, because this electricity was directly being used in northern Iraq, which led many Turkish nationalists to start asking, are Turkish companies now selling electricity to the Kurdish guerrilla? Because of domestic politics and many other factors that had to do with Iraq's domestic transformation as well, it became more feasible for the floating power plant company to pick up all its engines, put them on a ship, and take them to Basra and start producing electricity, this time in southern Iraq. Ships are very expensive, right? Usually it wouldn't be possible for a power generating company to buy a bunch of ships and put all their engines on them and park them in a harbor. But the 2008 crisis allowed for ship prices to decrease quite a bit. And so idling rates around the world skyrocketed. And so it became possible for the company to purchase all these ships at low prices and bring them to Istanbul, and in Istanbul's Tuzla shipyards, retrofit them and prepare them for electricity production, again, in Iraq initially. And the first ship that arrived in Iraq was basically producing electricity for the region around the U.S. detention center, Camp Bucca, which was right there on the Arab Gulf coast. And so the ship was close to this area. And soon after, this detention center was formulated as something called Basra Logistics City. So it was going to be one of those smart city projects that were popular at the time, or a special economic zone. And so the ship's electricity was useful for the population in the region, but also for powering these kinds of projects, right? I mean, it was part of the same electricity grid. And so, especially as now we're watching everything happening on the Strait of Hormuz and everything happening in Iran, it feels very both upsetting, but at the same time useful to sort of remember how wars produce infrastructure while at the same time destroying infrastructure. Who gets to benefit from the kinds of transformations that happen along the way, and how energy infrastructure in particular sits at the center of all these controversies and becomes the kind of the node through which all these decisions get made. So I found the history of the floating power plants quite surprising myself, because I didn't expect it was going to stretch all the way back to the Gulf War, to the early 90s, and 30, 35 years later have an effect on African grids now.
You tie these different, quite specific geopolitical relations, conflicts, 2008 financial crisis and the impact on shipping, to the formation of this new power source. There are lots of parallels with what's going on at the moment. Trump has threatened in recent months to bomb Iran's electricity generation as well. How inevitable was it that you would see something like this? Is the floating power plant a very specific product of all of those unique circumstances? Would it be almost unpredictable what form you might see in a future echo of similar events? Or is it something that could happen again?
I don't think necessarily it's inevitable as a product. And I think that's why all the Turkish businessmen I mentioned earlier, or the businesswomen that I mentioned earlier, were in awe of this project, because it didn't seem like it was an inevitable sort of outcome, but it was a good use of the given resources in a strategic manner that made sense. And that made both geopolitical sense, because it took advantage of the productive relations at the time between, say, the U.S. Embassy in Ankara and the Ministry of Energy in Turkey and the Ministry of Energy in Iraq, etc. So, it benefited from the Great Recession and the decreasing ship prices, etc. So I think it was not inevitable at all. But one reason why I thought it would be interesting to sort of investigate all of this history or the politics around energy infrastructure is because I found this interesting assemblage of things that brought the ship together. Why not try to unpack what the ship is and show what kinds of worlds come together around this object. What are the social and political lives that it's able to bring together and display to us? I don't know if you can use something like this as a predictive tool to understand what's going to happen at the end of the Iran war. But there are broad lessons that are available in this story, I think, for us to think about. And these broad questions about the way in which wars reshuffle geopolitical relationships, enabling certain kinds of openings for certain actors and closing opportunities or making opportunities unavailable to others. So that kind of mixing up the political scene is what we're seeing now.
I think it might be worth just briefly outlining a little bit more specifically what these floating power plants look like, how they operate. I know that you saw them being retrofitted into power plants. You also visited an operational one in Ghana, and that there's a bit of diversity between the different power ships. Could you tell us a bit more about them?
The power ships are basically built on dry bulk carriers, ships that are used to carry unpackaged cargo in a massive scale. And the initial ships were basically ships that were brought to Tuzla, Istanbul, into the shipyards, primarily to the Sedef shipyard, which because it owned the largest crane amongst the Tuzla shipyards, that was strong enough to lift the machines that made up the power ships. Instead of one engine that propels the ship has like 50 engines. There are dual fuel engines that are mostly sold by two companies, a German company and a Finnish company, that allow for the use of either heavy fuel oil or natural gas as fuel supply. It takes about 2 weeks to convert these engines from heavy fuel oil to natural gas. And so some of the ships around the world have been using natural gas while others are using heavy fuel oil. The company representatives often said, we would prefer to use natural gas in the places where it's available. It's more environmentally friendly. If it's available domestically, it's easier for the company to access it through pipelines. And so it would be a preferable option for them. But for instance, when I first visited the ship Aishigül Sultan in Ghana, it was operating on heavy fuel oil, which meant that it needed to be replenished every 3-4 days by a delivery by shuttle barge. And this shuttle barge would bring heavy fuel oil from another mothership located off the coast of Lomé in Togo. So there was a constant supply and burning of heavy fuel oil to produce electricity for the grid. Their larger ship, which was called Osman Khan, arrived there. It was producing about 450 megawatts of electricity for the grid. So it was one of their larger ships. But one of the reasons why it's been a successful project is because the power plants are often built in the places where they're going to function. But in this case, you can build a power plant in a shipyard and then take it into the place where it's going to operate. And all you need is high voltage transmission lines that are going to now attach the ship to the nearest substation. So in the case of Tema, Ghana, this was about 9 kilometers away for the first ship. And so that becomes a very easy addition. And so this is why the company calls it, like plug and play, that this is a modular infrastructure and that it can come and go whenever either the leasing country or the company itself pleases. And so that kind of flexibility is offered as a sort of an added advantage. I participated in one of the negotiations that a company representative had with Senegalese decision makers in Dakar. And during this negotiation, the Senegalese representatives kept asking, how much will electricity cost when we actually sort of lease this ship? But the company representatives refrained from engaging with them on the basis of price. They wanted to say, we don't negotiate based on price, but we can negotiate based on delivery times. Our ship can be here in 2 weeks and start producing electricity for your grid. Which other entity could be able to do that at this scale? Because obviously it would take much longer than 2 weeks to build a power plant in a location in Senegal. So that has become a really important selling point for them.
I'm keen to get onto some of the quote-unquote bigger ideas in the book. Perhaps to introduce that, you've got this quote fairly early on where you say, broadly, this book is a critique of the idea of linear progress. I put that down because I thought it might be a good starting point for you to set out some of the broader ambitions that you had with it.
So even though I started this project being really interested in the power ships themselves, as I started doing research on them, I realized that in order to be able to understand the powership itself, I would need to understand how it's contextualized within the Ghanaian grid. So I had spent some time in 2016 and then 17, 18, seeing the ship's operations in Ghana and meeting with the staff there. And then later on, I started spending more time with people in various Ghanaian agencies, so Electricity Company of Ghana, or a grid company, or the Energy Commission, Environmental Protection Agency, etc. So all kinds of entities that come together around electricity infrastructure. And during the early 2010s, so especially between 2012 and 2016, Ghana had an electricity crisis known as Dumsor. So that means off and on in Twi. This electricity crisis was quite devastating for everyone in Ghana because there would be load shedding throughout the years. People sometimes wouldn't have access to electricity for about 24 hours, for up to 24 hours. And so people ended up buying generators, now really dirty and loud on the streets. And of course, not everyone could afford generators. And many businesses collapsed. And at the same time, Ghanaians were really scared that this is going to lead to a lack of interest in terms of foreign direct investments into the country, which they really valued. So amid all of this, the Electricity Company of Ghana signed many power purchase agreements with independent power producers. So independent power producers would operate in the country for a pre-designated term and be able to fix this problem of power outages. At least this was the imagination at the time. So while I was doing research, I was also meeting with various energy experts, as I said, and one of them kept saying to me as he was watching this process of the buildup of the new kinds of independent power producers, he kept saying to me, do you see how we're transitioning in reverse? Because what happened was that in the early 2000s or until the turn of the century, all of Ghanaian electricity was produced by hydropower. And so the Volta Dam is really famous not only for its electricity production capacity, but also for its political symbolism. It stood in for African sovereignty, for Pan-African solidarity. It was a really important project. Of course, it also received criticism for the amount of displacement it caused and for the way in which it affected sort of the people who lived in these territories and for the ways in which it perhaps mimicked different kinds of developmentalist missions that were inherited from the global north, etc. But regardless, it's a really important project for Ghanaian national identity. But in the early 21st century, what started happening was that all the independent power producers almost who came into the country brought in fossil fuel infrastructure. So now about 2/3 of Ghanaian electricity is produced by fossil fuels. These energy experts I was meeting were obviously observing this landscape, and also at the same time, they're very active in attending global conferences and going to the climate change meetings. So they kept hearing this language of energy transition. And the only way they could make sense of the developments they were seeing around them was to say, I think we're transitioning in reverse. And many of the power stations that started operating in Ghana at the time were power stations that had already been used in other countries. So, for instance, Sunona Sogi, which is the largest power station in Ghana, it's a natural gas-powered power station. It had already been used in China for about 15 years and put on a cargo ship and brought to Tema, Ghana, and then rebuilt there. So its value had already depreciated, it had already been rendered inefficient in the Chinese context, but now it's producing electricity for Ghana. So this comment was just really stuck with me, and it made me ask, what does it mean to transition in reverse in the way that these really committed people are trying to unpack this transformation? And then that made me ask them, what does energy transition then mean? Because it was hard for me to believe that this can be a transition in reverse. How is it that there can be sort of linear progressions of some people transitioning in reverse while others transitioning in the direction that they're meant to transition? And so the book became an investigation into the idea of linear progress or a critique of linear progress, because as I read them more and understood that sort of energy transition is basically a repetition almost of the ways in which modernization theories post-World War II era have placed certain countries in developed or developing status and laid out a very clear path for them to follow in order for the developing countries to have a shot at being developed, even though obviously this race is structured so that the people who are in the front will never give up their winning positions, and the people in the back perhaps will only be able to measure their success by how close they get to the winners. Perhaps if we think about what does the nation state do as a category for us in this imagination, and how does the nation state category then help us broadly about how to mitigate climate change? So if the infrastructures that were used in places like, let's say, in this case, the Chinese power plant is a good example, if this is now decreasing, let's say, possibly the emissions from that nation state, but it's still producing emissions for the planet, for all of us to sort of live with. So in a way, the energy transition projects that are happening in one location are leading to this quote unquote transition in reverse activity happening in other places. So that whole questioning led me to think that there's no actual transition happening. There's only an increase in all kinds of energy production capacities across the world. And quantitatively speaking, too, this is the case, but obviously it's not necessarily something that we experience because so much of the calculation that work we do is through percentages. So what percentage of the world's electricity supply is being generated by renewable energy today? That's a percentage that's increasing, but that doesn't mean that fossil fuel use is not increasing at the same time.
So just to summarize quickly and check that we're following, you're kind of saying there's a flawed assumption that the energy transition in terms of the proportion of the energy mix in a given country is equivalent to decarbonization, whereas in actual fact, even if the proportion of renewables may go up, rarely see a decrease in the amount of fossil fuels.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you've got another kind of concept that you talk about in the first two chapters in relation to the powerships, which is this idea of technologies of deferral. And you use carbon capture as an example that people are probably more familiar with, but also look at the Ghanaian case study with powerships because they were, as I understand it, started in Ghana on this promise that they would be temporary and a transitional stopgap, but then they stuck around.
I think a really important point of the book is to show how, despite its formal qualities, this particular technology did not necessarily have the capacity to come in and leave as it pleased. Because the way power contracts are set up around the world is most often through what's called take-or-pay contracts. This means that if an independent power producer is being convinced to enter an electricity market like Ghana's, that independent power producer wants an incentives. They want to see that they're going to receive a payment regardless of how much of the electricity they produce on the market. And so take-or-pay contracts mean that the power producers receive that guarantee and are able to bring all their infrastructure and all their expertise into places where they don't know what kind of electricity infrastructural context exists, or they can't necessarily predict what kind of volume they're going to be producing, but they know what kind of payment they're going to receive at the end of each month. From the perspective of the Ghanaian government, these contracts are non-negotiable because they're in a power crisis. They need to bring electricity into the country, so they sign take-or-pay contracts regardless, even though they know that these contracts at the end are financially troubling for them. So the companies, the independent power producers come in and they now have this guarantee of receiving payment each month. So, of course, there's an incentive for whoever comes in through these contracts to want to stay financially and politically becoming invested into the project of extending the leases rather than, in the case of the power ship, using their ability to unplug and sail away whenever necessary. And these contracts are, of course, also they're the same for all the other power producers there as well. It's not necessarily something specifically set up for the power ship, but it creates a different kind of effect for the power ship because of its formal qualities and because it perhaps accentuates the contradictions that exist between the potential formal capacities of this power plant and the ways in which power contracts are set up. So invention becomes secondary to the inherent systemic conditions. But then, of course, it becomes also an opportunity for the power ship company. And so in the case of Ghana, one of the deputies of the Minister of Energy in Ghana came to Houston a few years ago to give a talk here at CERAWeek, and he was saying during his talk and also later on after his talk during sort of more informal comments that, Ghana spent a third of its tax revenue on pay contracts at certain points. And so these are significant volumes of resources being channeled for electricity that's not used. And the electricity is not used because there is either no demand for it in the country, or the transmission lines themselves are not necessarily doing the work of producing electricity that's already being produced by independent power producers, etc. So there are many reasons why overcapacity happens. And at the same time, the power ship company does not negotiate based on price. But if you want to export your excess electricity to other countries, those other countries are going to want to negotiate with you based on price. So then the country who's trying to sell their electricity to a bordering regions, then you're stuck with sort of a competitive market where your electricity ends up being much more expensive than other potential producers.
Just on that point about exporting surplus energy, I remember in the book you quote someone as saying something along the lines of global north, richer countries, when they end up in a similar situation to Ghana, that is just what they do, but Ghana's not able to do that. And I don't think that was just for the reasons about pricing that you're saying there. Could you elaborate why some countries are unable to sell the surplus energy that they generate?
One of the things that's really important in sort of trying to understand electricity markets is that it's really hard to match supply and demand on electricity markets, because electricity can't be stored and set aside, and therefore there needs to always be sort of an imagination of a balance between supply and demand. The electricity producers I met were saying to me that mismatch between supply and demand is really standard as a problem in electricity markets. But if you have more demand than supply, then you have a condition of energy hunger, and people are unable to sort of access electricity in the way that they want. And perhaps because of the ways in which their grids might not be integrated to other regional grids, or because there might not be sort of regional arrangements or legal arrangements that allows for one country to purchase electricity from another country, then you end up in a situation of energy hunger. And then in the other context, the excess exists because you're unable to sell your electricity to others. Towards the end of the book, I talk a little bit about what happens to excess electricity in the Ghanaian context and how people are trying to take advantage of this excess domestically and build electric car infrastructure in order to absorb overcapacity and also curb the problem of electricity excess by bringing in middle-class, upper-middle-class consumers into the electricity market there domestically. But as I was researching this, I also found it really fascinating to understand how excess electricity has been a problem in other contexts as well. And for instance, when streetcars were the primary vehicle for public transportation, and when they required so much electricity to run during the day, producers didn't know what to do with that excess electricity at nighttime, which is why they ended up building amusement parks like Coney Island Amusement Park, which is really well lit and clearly a demonstration of the region's ability to use electricity in a carefree manner, and then to also use the existing streetcar infrastructure to bring people to those amusement parks. So then that also remains active later into the night, and its operations can continue further than they would perhaps if this was just limited to the workday. So again, you see how spatial transformations also happen through excess electricity in the same way that I was seeing in Ghana with the spatial transformation of traffic and of driving practices through excess electricity. And then another example that's really useful to remember is how in the post-World War II era in the US, the utility companies were leasing or selling appliances for domestic use. So for instance, fridges being delivered to households so that people can all of a sudden have this consistent demand for electricity in their kitchens through their use of appliances. And now all of these things have become sort of second nature to us. We never question why we have fridges in our houses. Of course, we love our fridges. But the origin of that story, if you want to dig into it in the US context, is the utilities problem, where electricity companies try to create new consumers in domestic contexts.
Really interesting. It's a similar point in a way to what we were saying earlier about the formation of power ships as a result of these complex set of circumstances.
Exactly. You couldn't necessarily imagine that post-World War II sort of politics would result in like the proliferation of fridges. It's hard to predict perhaps what kinds of technologies are going to result from these arrangements.
When you're talking about those take-or-pay contracts or the power purchase agreements, you have a page where you talk about how there was a push in Ghana for more transparency around these contracts, but you question how much value might even come from that, or whether transparency always leads to the positive outcomes that people would expect.
There's an expectation that transparency leads to change among certain kinds of political actors. And transparency and having access to knowledge is perhaps a good starting point for having a conversation about contemporary political social dynamics. But then to expect that transparency immediately leads to change, I think this is a link that I've had trouble making. Because, for instance, let's take contracts aside and think about something that we're hearing about constantly these days, AI and the way in which data centers are going to cause environmental harm and they're going to become huge demand centers for electricity, etc. And so we know all those things. Many people are speaking about them, but that doesn't mean that there's anything that we're capable of doing to change those dynamics. In the case of the Ghanaian debate, I think that the push for transparency did bring together a certain kind of group of people who were troubled by what was going on in their country and wanted to have better access to how these contracts are made and who signs them and how are they actually enacted and what's the day-to-day of these contracts. That in itself, I think, generates some kind of social and political solidarity, which is really useful. But then if you receive transparent results, it's also kind of a question to ask, what does transparency mean in that context and who decides whether something is transparent or not? So, for instance, Andrew Barry's book about the Baku-Tiflis-Ceyhan pipeline, about the BTC pipeline that was being built in the early 21st century, it really does a great job of showing what transparency meant, because all the companies that were involved in the production of the pipeline wanted to create a transparency, but that was the way they understood transparency was the way they wanted to push it forward. And types of information were allowed in those transparent reports, and other kinds of information were curated according to the final goals that these corporations have.
So to have another go at concise summary, would it be fair to characterize that as transparency initiatives through certain power structures are unlikely to change the nature of those power structures?
Yes, that's really well put. Exactly.
I know there's loads about geopolitics that we could get into, but because it's a phrase I saw come up a few times, you talk about Turkey's foreign policy as imperialism by anti-imperialists, or at least use that quote. I was just interested for you to set out what that means.
When I started doing research on this project, I had the opportunity to, again, meet many business people from Turkey who were trying to do projects across African countries. But then I also had this really unexpected opportunity to join a diplomatic trip with the Turkish president and ministers and 120 businessmen to go to Algeria, Senegal, and Mauritania. And during those trips, the businessmen and the government representatives had the capacity to introduce Turkish projects or Turkish political inclinations to all the interested parties that they met in these countries. And one of the pressing points that Erdogan in his speeches made is that global North actors exploited African countries. They enacted and engineered the transatlantic slave trade, that were responsible for resource exploitation across the continent in all kinds of ways and still continue to be responsible for that. And so Erdogan was seeking to say the Ottoman Empire never colonized Africa. It never enslaved its peoples. It was a kind of ethical force that you can sort of think about or rely on historically. And then now Turkey, as its extension, is here to stand against these kinds of imperial forces and form a certain form of solidarity with African countries standing against the global North. And the idea here is that by using anti-imperialist rhetoric, Turkish companies and the Turkish government are trying to advance what the historian I refer to in the text calls anti-imperialism by anti-imperialists. So they do have their own imperial goals, but those imperial goals are easier to facilitate through an anti-imperialist rhetoric. And so at the end, to extend beyond that point of imperialism, what I found really helpful, and this goes back to your point about the idea of linear progress, is that what was really significant for Turkish players was to then say, you know what, we're all on the same track towards development. We're all modernizing. We're all becoming more developed. But Turkey is ahead of Ghana, and we were not always here, so we can show you how to get ahead in a way that a global North actor cannot. So the difference between Turkey and Ghana on that modernization timeline was what allowed different Turkish decision makers to say, this is why we need to be here. So it was still Turkey's difference or its location on that modernization timeline that justifies this presence in African countries such as Ghana. I found that really fascinating because it gave me something that even sort of extends beyond the idea of imperialism by anti-imperialists to show me exactly how the imagination of progress serves as a very specific mechanism through which that quote-unquote imperialism happens. So it's not just about the rhetoric of saying we didn't colonize African countries, we didn't enslave African peoples, etc. But it's also about saying we subscribe to the model of modernization that has been circulating now since the post-World War II era, and we've done better at that modernization timeline than you have. So let us hold your hand and bring you closer to us on that modernization timeline. So the geopolitical dominance of global North countries, in a way, extends itself in that rhetoric of solidarity between Turkish decision makers and African decision makers at large. So that in itself allows us to question, what does South-South solidarity mean? What do South-South relations mean? The geopolitical forces that actually structure the world that we live in today can't happen in a vacuum.
I know we've not talked about the second half of your book much, and I wouldn't ask you to summarize all of that in a few minutes, but is there anything you'd like to say about renewable energy in Ghana or the future of the energy mix in Ghana?
I think one of the things that I found most surprising as I did research on this project was the way in which electric cars were perceived as a departure from this modernization timeline that I discussed. So because there was so much pressure across electric car promoters to say electric cars need to be integrated into a grid after renewables arrive. So electric cars are supposed to act as mobile batteries that circulate around and absorb the surplus electricity that renewable energy power stations produce at certain times of the day. In the context of the Ghanaian grid, yes, there was some solar power being produced on the grid, but the reason why electric cars became integrated into the grid was not because they were trying to produce batteries for these solar power stations. It was primarily to curb the problem of electricity excess. When they introduced this solution to international conferences, then a representative faced criticism saying, first you need to have renewable power stations and then you have to bring the electric cars. But when they were describing their projects to me, they were focused on saying that electric cars might change the way in which progress is imagined. But they would bring electric cars into Ghana, and then they said, you know what, maybe the renewable energy infrastructure will follow because we'll be able to have the circulating batteries on the move in our cities. And they'll have different kinds of effects, bringing different kinds of entrepreneurs together and creating this space for startups, etc. But at the same time, they had the effect of preventing the dumping of gas-powered cars from European countries into Ghana. Imagine that if they actually have electric car infrastructure in place, they would be able to safeguard themselves from the potential dumping that will happen once gas-powered cars become less desirable in European countries and once electric cars become more dominant forms of transportation in European countries. And so if they want to protect themselves from that dumping, then they need to do the work of putting together electric car infrastructure now. That kind of reshuffling of this timeline and asking questions about the assumed timeline of where products go in the world and who gets to consume what was quite insightful for me.
My thanks to Gökçe Günel for coming on the show, and to Vasco Kostovski for our audio engineering. Gökçe's among the few returning guests that we've had on the podcast, so if you missed our first interview about her previous book, do give that a listen as well. It's the episode titled, Can Gulf Petrostates Really Build Green Cities? You can find links to buy both books in the blurb for this episode, as well as an edited excerpt from Floating Power that we've published on Land and Climate Review, which includes more about the history of energy in Ghana and the differences between expectations and realities with the phrase energy transition. Alistair will be back in 2 weeks, so remember to follow us on your preferred podcast platform if you haven't already, and until then, goodbye, and thank you for listening.